When I was a young boy, and frankly a stupid one, I described the original F.E.A.R as something along the lines of extreme sexual pleasure in an uncomfortable environment. My reasoning behind this was that the game had excellent gun combat in a few nondescript industrial areas and then presented more of the same, and more of the same, and then even more of the same. My mistake was not realizing that the repetition so rarely harmed the game in any way that truly mattered. The fact of the matter is that more of the same excellent sort of gun-fu is exactly what F.E.A.R needed and deserved, and with Extraction Point, its first expansion pack, that dialed up to 11 is exactly what it got. Extraction Point tries a tiny bit to be a direct sequel, although the story is completely negated by the fact that F.E.A.R now has a direct sequel, as you play as the original F.E.A.R operative immediately following the ending of the original game. The story in F.E.A.R Extraction Point is right in its title. You are a F.E.A.R guy and you have to get to an extraction point that your squad mate tells you about, and that's literally it. F.E.A.R actually had a pretty rich emotional story to tell, but the lack of one in Extraction Point won't leave you sour like going from Dead Space's expansive universe and cohesive narrative to Dead Space 2 and 3's high school romance bullshit. The original story's delivery was so awful and distant from the gameplay in the first place that the expansion pack was just trimming the fat by getting rid of it all but entirely. And only whores would play a game this great because of story, Naz. The meat of the game is of course the gunplay. The game shamelessly reuses pretty much every art and programming asset from its parent, but it uses everything to build something near perfect on the already amazing foundation provided. F.E.A.R set itself apart from most shooters in a lot of ways, but its biggest point of distinction was that its AI was not cannon fodder. It was a game about actually fighting enemies just as much as it was about separating their legs from their torso in slow motion, and the good people at Timegate understood this fact very well. What you normally get in a F.E.A.R game is a pretty complex environment that's almost always on some sort of grid. There are loads of walls and pieces of cover and catwalks that make it possible for both you and the enemy to pull off plenty of cool moves, and Extraction Point expands the environments into something even better. Many of the gunfights take place out of doors or in areas that are otherwise pretty open, and these arenas are commonly far larger than in any other F.E.A.R game. Fittingly in them, you encounter groups of enemies quite a bit larger than the regular squad of half a dozen guys, and how they use the environment is as amazing as it ever was, just on a much grander scale. The original game utilized its flanking, grenade-throwing, cover-vaulting AI in a truly wondrous way, but with even more viable routes and levels in its environments, Extraction Point trumps its parents' combat in every way. There are also loads of physics objects that add a whole lot to the firefights in a way that so few games have even tried to replicate. The parent game had explosive stuff like barrels and electrical boxes peppered around the environments, but they were pretty much just like in any other shooter, pretty limited and just arbitrarily dotted around. Extraction Point has explosives galore, and they pack an astounding wallop. They're often among other dynamic physics objects that they send flying when they explode, like chunks of support pillars or non-explosive barrels. Sometimes all these stray objects can be dangerous, and others they're purely cosmetic. Either way though, the added reactance of the environment creates even more of an adrenaline rush than F.E.A.R already did. No positive sentiment does justice to the feeling you get when the grenade you threw at a guy in slow motion blows up the electrical box behind him, knocking over a rack of large pipes on the wall and temporarily stunning him, a hellfire raging all the while nearby from the large oil tank you just shot open. The same goes for when an enemy's grenade or stray buckshot does the exact same thing to you. The massive, detailed destruction makes Extraction Point special even among the already amazing original F.E.A.R and its other expansion pack, Perseus Mandate. Extraction Point also makes a few small but extremely potent additions to your arsenal. Along with all the original weapons, it lets you play with a minigun and a laser rifle as well. The minigun is just as fun as you'd expect from a minigun since it's a fucking minigun, but because the enemy AI is versatile and the environments are large, it doesn't render all your other weapons useless when you have it. The laser rifle is great too, especially when you're randy for some singeing and decapitating, but it uses up its ammo pretty quickly and doesn't appear nearly as often as it probably should. Also new to the game are deployable turrets. They have pretty low health, but they're just great invaluable tools for distracting enemies and even taking a few down when you face larger groups. All these additions are of course aided by slow motion, and while there's nothing new in the expansion pack in regards to that ability, it would be ludicrous not to mention it. The advantage you have over enemies when you slow time encourages creativity, rushing into the heart of battle and doing things you wouldn't dare accomplish without it. Every addition to the game works perfectly with slow motion, whether it's the hail of bullets you unleash with your minigun, or an intense explosion that shakes the entire room and sends chunks of wall flying all over the place. It all both looks great and adds something marvelous to the firefights. Apart from an early level set in a church which suspiciously resembles a mixture of drab offices and sewers, Extraction Point doesn't add any new environments to the F.E.A.R repertoire. It's still just as repetitive as its parent, both in terms of environment and gameplay, but that's not a problem when the repeated content is even better than its already high standard. Apart from a few large armored units and some other enemies who make brief appearances, the one enemy type you fight throughout the entire campaign is still the clone soldier in a bunch of nondescript industrial environments. But because the AI and destruction are so dynamic and the arenas themselves are quite varied, no two firefights are ever the same. Granted, a one-note game still needs pacing to keep its gameplay from becoming overwhelming, and like all other F.E.A.R games, Extraction Point paces itself with really shitty horror. For the most part, the game does pace itself well, and players have the added bonus this time around of horror segments that are really fun to watch, if nothing else. The one area where it messes up is in a later level that takes itself too seriously and decides to devote itself mostly to a dark hospital environment with a new enemy type that runs around mostly invisible but isn't much of a challenge. In addition, that level seemed to give me some pretty bad performance problems, and while that could possibly be attributed to my terrible computer, as I understand it, I'm not alone in experiencing them. However, this poor segment does very little to hurt the overall quality of the game. Extraction Point is very iterative of its parent, so much that the two games share the exact same qualities and shortcomings, but it makes a number of improvements on the original formula. Monolith's F.E.A.R was a bona fide masterpiece, but that didn't stop Extraction Point from trying and succeeding to do even better. Every addition it makes to the gameplay is remarkable and works toward the common goal of reaching the absolute pinnacle of firefights in gaming. Just like F.E.A.R, it's a game for anybody interested in shooting.
Are you still a virgin?